Awesome to welcome author of the Mid-Range Theory, Seth Partnow, to the Basketball Podcast. Partnow covers the NBA and basketball analytics for The Athletic. He is the former director of basketball research for the Milwaukee Bucks. The Mid-Range Theory book dives into topics from shot selection to evaluating prospects to considering aesthetics and ethics while analyzing the box scores. Partnow deftly explores where the NBA is now, how it got here, and where it might be going next. We're going to talk about that and more on the Basketball Podcast. Seth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed listening over the last year plus. So it's fun to be here.
I floated out on social media that you were going to be on the podcast, and I got a lot of DMs and texts from coaches at all levels of basketball, NBA, NCAA, Europe, high school. And so many of them had already read the book and loved the book. So we're going to talk about that, but also just so many of them had some really curious questions. So we're going to get to all that, but let's start with maybe why should anyone at any level read your book?
There's really two aspects, I think. The first is to hopefully demystify the concept of analytics and make illustrate the way it is. It's just talking about basketball in another way, and to put some of these concepts, which can maybe seem abstruse or mathematically and technologically dense, put them into basketball terms, which is the language that basketball coaches speak. The second one is to emphasize that it's not about being perfect or knowing everything or any of that. It's about being better. It's the same thing you do in practice every day. You're not trying to be perfect. You're trying to be better. Studying the game from a statistical lens is about knowing more than you did yesterday, not knowing everything and not having the perfect answers, but gaining advantage by, bits and pieces of asking the right questions and just knowing a little bit more. And so perhaps sort of cueing some ideas about how to learn more about your team, your players, the opposition coming up, to give you that little bit of an extra edge kind of every day.
And I love how you phrased it to, and you've said this, I've heard you say this before, that like you haven't solved basketball and analytics don't solve basketball, but the ideal is they put us in a situation where we're less wrong, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's I cannot claim to have come up with that terminology, but that's definitely the way I think about it is just knowing a little bit more today than I did yesterday. It's a complicated game and there's a lot of stuff you just don't know. And you're making educated guesses a lot. But if you're those guesses are a little more educated, then maybe you're right 60% of the time instead of 55% of the time. And if everyone else is still at 55, that's a pretty big edge.
It's a great edge. And, we're probably beyond the point where people aren't buying into analytics. I would say by and large, I would say most basketball coaches I've been around, love getting into it and love learning more. So this is great. But you also mentioned some of the cognitive biases that we all suffer. Can you just shape some of those for us to understand maybe what we're still fighting against in terms of getting this next level of understanding?
Sure. We have developed over the course of kind of the evolution some heuristics, some mental routines that generally have served us pretty well in terms of survival. But now that as we get into sort of more intellectual pursuits, sometimes lead us down wrong paths. I don't even know which one to start with, but there's just so many. I think recency bias is certainly one that can affect people. The most recent thing you've seen is taken as reality instead of looking at the whole course of a player.
That's a big one for coaches, by the way. Like the most recent play or the most recent thing I learned, et cetera. It's going to solve the problem.
I mean, I think it's always, they say the mid-range shot is a bad shot. Well, a guy might have made two in a row, but we don't really care about the last two shots. We care about the last 100 and the last 1,000 or whatever kind of scale you're working on. So getting almost too results oriented in like what happened on the last play. We've all experienced, you play great defense for the entire shot clock and a guy heaves one in from 30 feet. Do you want to play that same defense every possession? Yeah. Even if the shot went in. or at times the guy misses an open dunk. You don't want to, you don't want to play that defense again, because you don't want to give up that attempt, because 95% of the time that's an easy two. And so thinking in a more
I'll give you another example.
Way.
Sorry, just to add to that. Like we play zone as a coach and we go, oh, this is the best decision for us. Then we get scored on the first possession and then we don't play zone again.
Right. It's like, oh, they made 1-3. Well, you're making that bet that over, 5, 10, 15 possessions. Yeah, they might make a 3 or 2, but you're getting a better overall outcome of those possessions because of what the opposition isn't getting, because you're sort of conceding some of, I don't want to say conceding, but willing to live with certain other shots.
Mm-hmm. And the past way of doing things is a big one too, isn't it? And that seems to be where a lot of coaches still are stuck.
Yeah, it's the insanity is repeating the same things and expecting different outcomes, right? I mean, if you're trying to get better, sometimes you have to realize there's things you're doing now that aren't as good as they could be. And sometimes the things that were done in the past were sort of, not to be, I try to avoid being too technical, but like they were optimal given the resources, given the technology, given the state of the game and game strategy. Things may have been optimal in that setting. And now that we know more, now the game has progressed, now that video is more readily available at your fingertips, now that there are technologies like Synergy or stuff like that, now we can do things that we couldn't do before because the access to information is just greater.
So I'll give you just an example with what I share, and I know you're familiar with it and we've discussed it, but some of the ideas like drill makeover, applying evidence ideas around skill acquisition or more learning to what we do. And again, it's just like, it's one of these things that we try and approach it from the coach's perspective to just ask them the question, is there a better way? And that's what you're asking throughout the book is basically, is there a better way? It's not that you have the answer, but is there a better one?
And sort of always examining that, like, and almost more importantly, like, even when you've had success, asking, is there a better way? It's easy to ask, is there a better way after a loss? Because, the feedback is pretty clear. Well, I shouldn't say that. The feedback certainly pushes one to that direction. The desire to, when things worked out, yeah, it was perfect, everything happened according to plan. That's almost one of the biggest pitfalls that you can fall into, and not like improving upon success and sort of anticipating that what happened will continue to happen forever. It's definitely a tendency, certainly of you see this in fan bases, like, oh, well, we only lose when we don't make shots, or we only lose when the opponent has an outlier shooting game. It's like, well, those things happen too. And maybe you want to do things, your team wants to be better. You want your team to be better. So it's a little more like robust to those sorts of outcomes. But it's very easy to ascribe the wins to skill and the losses to luck. And that's a pretty sure way to put yourself in bad spots, I think.
I got this variation of question from maybe almost all the NBA assistants that reach out to me about this podcast. And the variation is this: can you get Seth to explain to people why the word analytics is not just about shooting threes? Variations of that. But you basically say in the book, the word analytics is not the right word.
I mean, it's been pretty hopelessly bastardized.
Yeah.
There's a gentleman who has been a kind of a leader in player development, especially for pitchers in baseball, named Kyle Boddy. He runs a company called Driveline Baseball, kind of out of Tacoma, Washington, and has previously worked as a player development exec with the Cincinnati Reds. As he put it, like, a lot of the pushback against analytics is either as he put it, a low field practitioner kind of has sort of bull and china shopped their way through explaining concepts in sort of a dismissive and overly arrogant way, or kind of someone in the media has done a very ham-handed job of describing or defining what it is. And I think in basketball, at least, the latter is much more true than than the former. Although I mean, there's always the case where things explained poorly lead to sort of almost a visceral revulsion, right? If someone comes to you with, hey, coach, I know you have 25 experience, but you really don't know anything. Let me tell you a better way. Like, no matter how correct the advice is, it's not going to stick because you can't really come at people that way for the most part.
So let's start at a really simple level. I think many people have been exposed first to this whole conversation through Dean Oliver's work in the 4 factors: shooting, turnovers, rebounding, free throws. So let's digest that. Is that still applicable to most coaches at most levels?
Yeah. I mean, I think you might change some of that a little bit in sort of the 3-point era and our ability, at least at kind of high NCAA plus level of basketball, to know a little bit more about kind of shot selection. But in general, yeah, it's what basketball is. You take and make good shots and prevent the opponent from doing the same. You don't foul on defense. You protect the backboard and you take care of the ball. Like, that's basketball, right? And I think that's the genius of the 4 factors, is it's distilling those really basic tenets to a more objective scale that really allows you to grade things. So yeah, no, I think those are still hugely applicable and really pretty strong. I mean, remain very strong indicators of why a team is sort of the why and how. The distinction there is a little fuzzy. So I'll say it's the how and why somewhere in there of why a team is sort of performing well or poorly on offense or defense.
So the 4 factors and other things like that made it accessible to coaches who don't have access to, say, higher level tracking and analytics. But yeah, let's go maybe a little bit deeper for those coaches that don't have that option to be able to, say, even get synergy or obviously second spectrum. What are some of the most important things that we can do to operationalize this for them?
I think on some level, kind of context is always key. Sort of a lot of it is sort of fancy counting in a way, and I think that's an expression that, again, the head of Second Spectrum has used at times before. A lot of it is like, what set gets us which shots, not did they go in or not. Did we generate, we ran chin 5 times. How many times did we get a quality look? However you want to define a quality look. Like, I think at certainly lower levels of basketball, that's a little bit of a qualitative judgment rather than having, fully tracked and, being able to come up with an estimated expected shooting percentage or something like that. But you don't need that. You just need to know, you can almost just good shot, bad shot, or good shot, okay shot, bad shot. And then if you sort of cross-reference that with how you got there, if you're tracking like who was in the game or what set did we call, that's all already just a ton more information. Yeah, you can do it off makes and misses, but then you're sort of a little, you're only going to run the same play how many times a game. And then you're a little bit beholden to kind of the normal, especially if you end up with jump shots, even if they're open, kind of the make or miss variance. And you don't want to make decisions going forward based on that. You want to make it, from the moment the ball leaves the shooter's hand, am I happy with this possession? And sort of reducing it to that level, I think that can tell you a tremendous amount about how the process of your team's offense, or flip it around, the process of your team's defense. And that's really what you're going for, because, you're that's sort of a better way to ensure good results, or not ensure, but influence towards, I'll say, good results in the future, is if those processes are sound.
It's great stuff. And I want to come back to your chin example and dive a little bit deeper, because that's a good example there. But just for simplicity here, what's the difference between an open shot on the perimeter and an open shot at the rim, and how we define that nowadays?
Well, I mean, I think you have to be much closer at the rim to effectively bother a shot than you do on the perimeter. And this is something that I've talked about a lot. Is I understand why kind of at the the stats as presented on NBA.com use sort of one definition, but you can, because you have so much variety of ways you can finish, left hand, right hand, all leaning back and stuff like that around the rim. You have to be pretty close. You have to be, 2-4 feet away from a guy body to body to really affect that shot. Whereas, especially if you're closing out on a shooter, you can affect the shooting motion from further away. And I think like exactly how that's defined depends by level. At the NBA level, like an open 3-pointer is defender 6 feet or more away. And that's empirical. It's not like a judgment call. It's just even if you get into really granular data, sort of the break point is around 5.5 feet really over the time period. We have tracking data, but 6 feet is good enough. And then there's a zone where it's sort of semi-contested, or what you might say is NBA open. And then within 4 feet, it's tightly contested. Funny thing is, NBA players are NBA players because they make good decisions. So there actually aren't that many 3-pointers taken with a defender closer than 4 feet away. And that's it, which leads itself to sort of, not to go down a rabbit hole here, but thinking about how you're actually tracking things is important, because if you're judging it just based on shooting percentage, you're missing a whole category of shots that would be taken, threes that would be taken with the defender like 3 feet away. Those shots are generally deferred. That's a good defensive outcome in most cases. But if you're just looking at shooting percentage, you're eliminating almost the best defense you played by the guy deciding to not shoot. And then that's again why getting to sort of the process, what the outcome of the possession wasn't the ball going in or not. It's, did the opponent get a good shot or not? Did we get a good shot or not? And figuring out the really qualitatively what you think that is, more so than any sort of outside imposed definition, I guess, because it's going to depend, completely on your personnel and the level you're playing at.
It's fascinating stuff. And really, for coaches who are doing this, the most important thing is that they have consistency in their evaluation of what it is, right?
Yep. And you can refine it over time. And I think most coaches probably have a decent sense of how to, good shot, bad shot, in between. I think as you start tracking these things, you might find that your intuitions were off a little bit, and you can adjust sort of those definitions going forward. But you kind of need to sort of systematically be tracking these things first before you can identify where you might be off a little bit in one direction or another.
Yeah, good point. And then, so back to that chin example, the question becomes then a little bit of what I've always wrestled with is it actually the play chin or a specific action within chin, or is it getting a specific player or personnel in a position where they can make a play and then evaluating that? Because I think too often we credit the offensive system and the offense rather than actually that we just got the player in the right spot.
And that's a really good point. And that sort of gets into why the sort of the dichotomy between analytics and eye test is wrong. Is this tracking can tell you what happened pretty well. Can't always tell you why. So you identify the situation by the what, and then, if you're talking about a specific, set like that, then, okay, well, we did it 8 times. It's not too hard for me to watch those 8 plays and come up with some qualitative thoughts about what worked and what didn't. But at least I'm guided in my study of what to look for by knowing sort of what those outcomes were. Okay, we got good stuff out of this. Why? Now, to even get to the question of asking the why, you do need to know that you got the good stuff or you didn't out of this set. And so that helps frame the question that you're studying. And that's sort of the more traditional sort of watch the video and turn your kind of X's and O's eyes onto it, as well as the broader picture of what happened here. So what am I really interested in finding out? And those things have to work together, or you're missing something.
And I wanted to bring that out because, again, what you paint the picture of is the importance of the coach and the experience and, whatever we call it, feel, intuition, whatever, from all of our experiences as in coaching is still incredibly valuable in evaluating, again, why something happened and how we can keep repeating it over time.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is something that intuitive decision-making requires reps. Coaches of any sort of level of experience probably have sufficient reps to be able to intuitively identify that's good or bad when watching on individual levels. It's just you need the aggregate also to kind of keep yourself from overly making decision on sort of small sample of, hey, we got a really great shot out of that play once, but that doesn't necessarily indicate you do it all the time. Okay, you got a great shot out of that play. Did a defender fall down? That's not a great indicator for it being successful in the future. So if you ran it 100 times and had success once, you kind of keep yourself from overly. I remember we ran it that one time and it was perfect, so we just have to run it better. It's like, if you did it 100 times, that was the only time it worked, then maybe not.
Well, I'll give you examples. When I did my master's, this is again 25 years ago, we ran kind of a Princeton style type of offense. It wasn't pure Princeton, and I remember doing, outcomes and evaluating what actually led to the outcome. And most of the time, it was amazing how many times I just wrote, like I tagged one-on-one or ISO or just someone made a play. Like it wasn't the offense. It was just something happened. As you said, something happened with the defense or something happened within the offense that led to that opportunity for someone to take advantage of advantage. And that's ultimately where we have to prepare players the most, is to take advantage of advantage.
And I would go even further than that, is that probably helps you understand what spots do my players, are they able to create advantage or take advantage of an edge? There's guys have spots on the floor. It's why that is sort of very complex and sort of probably a topic for a future book, which I am not in any way qualified to write. But no, you can start to, if I get my 2 guard, like if I can get situations where he's attacking closeouts from the left wing, he's great. If he's ISOing against the set defense from the top of the floor, not so much. Like you can start to identify those patterns, and then maybe you want to do some drills to improve his ability in isolation from the top of the floor, but you also want to run sets that put him in situations that he already performs well in. So it sort of pushes you down like almost the now path and the future for skill improvement path, and identifies where like one of those things are and the other isn't. And I can't imagine I'm saying things that coaches don't already know. It's just how you get there, make it a little easier, make it a little more systematic.
Well, and that's kind of my point a little bit, is that what I learned from all of that is, obviously too often, I think high school, college, maybe not at the NBA as much, but we celebrate the ball reversal, the 10 passes that lead to the score. And what I found when I did that study, and then it drove me throughout, is like, the less we pass, the better we got if we could create an advantage quicker. And that was kind of a mindset to help that team actually shift and play better basketball as it got towards the end of the year, to not run all these actions and get to the point faster.
Right. And I think that there's a competing thing here. Like, you do want to celebrate, like, keeping in your continuity. Okay, we don't have anything yet, but let's keep working it. And then we have it and we go. But that's instrumental to creating that advantage. That's not the thing. That's, the chapter on Goodhart's law is basically what that, it's not the it's not the 4 passes that was, it's not the Normandale 4 passes that was the thing. It was okay, we made these plays, created an advantage, put them in rotation, and got our best driver to attack a closeout. If that happens off of 1 pass or 7, it's still a good outcome. So you're not really caring about the number of passes so much as you are getting to that like spot in your offense.
Good point. So I'm fascinated. I got this question from a college coach, and it was very interesting to me, their perspective. But what is changing, or what should be changing in terms of player development if we're moving players along with this understanding now of the math behind basketball? Should it be driving a different approach to player development at this point, or are we still in its infancy and it probably doesn't have that big a sample to be able to tell us, hey, this should be the focus?
So this is a really interesting question that comes up a lot. Because on some level, and this is a conversation that I think that I really credit some of like the sort of the more traditional basketball minds. Like, hey, you don't want a guy shooting mid-range. How's he ever going to learn to shoot the mid-range?
Mm-hmm.
And for most players, that's not actually a problem. Like the kind of the mid-range is the province of like the most talented, the star players. How do you know? How do you find out if you don't give players chances to develop that? And that's a tough balance. So it's the working on, these are the situations we're going to put you in the game in our offense. And we're going to try to, for most players, we're going to try that to be, you're catching and shooting an open 3, you're cutting to the basket, you're attacking a closeout with the intention of either getting all the way to the basket or drawing help and kicking rather than shooting a pull-up. But for the player you want to progress to be your offensive difference maker, your star, how do you get them to make those harder sort of in-between decisions? How do you get them to work on those more difficult, lower efficiency in the individual play, but those plays that sort of unlock everyone else making the simple play? And I don't know if I have a good answer for that, other than recognizing that tension exists. And there is a little bit of a tension between what helps us win tonight and what's going to be important for my program in 2 years, when this sophomore who's got some talent, but we've got better players now, when he has to be the guy, when he or she has to be the main cog in the offense. And I'm not sure there is an answer to that, other than recognizing that those are 2 tracks that you're working on. I'm like, if you're waiting till this player has to be the engine to start teaching those things, it's too late. But you also don't want them to be like freelancing too much when that's not their role on your team today.
Well, and I think the NBA gives us a little bit of the answer, in the sense that really talented, say, multi-skilled mid-range and 3 players get placed in roles where they do much simpler things at the NBA level, and at other levels they would obviously have more multi-skill approach. So probably more holistic, but with a focus on their future, but within your program, more of a role definition.
Yeah, but you don't want to be too limiting.
Totally.
So this is
tough. That is
the
danger. You're absolutely right.
And I had this, I was on Eddie Johnson's radio show about a month ago, and we talked about this with respect to Mikal Bridges. And it's like, right now, do you want Mikal Bridges taking a lot of mid-range shots? No. Is Mikal Bridges talented enough that you kind of want to see if he can be that guy? Yeah, I think so. So how do you balance that? Now, the Suns are good enough that they can probably afford to use a possession or 3 a game to find that out. But that's a luxury of already being like a really excellent team that not everyone has. So for a team that's not quite as high performing, how do you balance that?
Well, and
I don't know.
I was on the Detroit Bad Boys podcast with Bryce Simon, and we actually brought that up in reverse, because for the Pistons, almost for their young players, they're not, I'm not saying they're not trying to win, but they have less of an interest in winning. Right. So they should be focusing on more, what are the things that are going to lead to those young players' long-term success rather than short-term success. And again, what a challenge either way.
And when do you like the example there is probably like Sadiq Bey, right? When do you pull the plug and like, okay, no, 3-and-D is probably his ideal role. Like we gave it the college try on having him operate in the mid range, and I just don't think it's going to happen. Like when do you make that decision?
That's
these
the
are,
art of it, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely, and and that's why it's always an art, not a science, because there's the individual player is more complex than any model or system can really tell us.
Yeah, and I know for that example with Steve Bay, I mean, there's fan base that's just losing their mind because he's doing things outside of what he did to be so successful, say in his first year. But again, that has to be part of his growth in some way. It just happens in this case under a really, really big microscope. Yeah. But you're right. At some point, they might have to pull him back.
And I think there's almost a sub lesson for coaches. There is, if you want a player to try something, you have to give them permission to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's like, and it's not on them. It's not, I mean, it's on you. And that's okay, because that evaluation has value in and of itself. Like obviously in the NBA context, like it's, thinking ahead to next contract and other player acquisitions as well. But a player trying something and failing is actually pretty valuable. It's really good information that you get. And that's sort of always a sort of a frustration with me or often a frustration with me with how teams treat young players, is they don't give themselves, you've got a 2 or 3 season evaluation window on a first round pick. If you get to year 3 and you just don't know, I think you've done something wrong. Like maybe there's been injuries or something like that prevented you, but you don't want to be in that situation going into, do we sign him to an extension or not, and not have a good sense of what he can be. And even if you find out he's not the guy, that's pretty useful to know rather than kind of guessing at it. And, if you're in a situation of guessing at it, we talked about biases earlier. Optimism bias tends to take over there. And that's where, teams tend to make a lot of mistakes. It's like, oh yeah, no, we'll fill in all these blanks that we don't know with A+. And yeah, it looks great if we fill those in with A+. And obviously like a C is more likely, just because that's how things work. Average, like the average on average is average.
There's so much to go into, and I'm big on decision making. So let's do that as a starting point for some data. Is it possible to simplify, say, the shoot, drive, pass, on the catch decision? Is it possible to simplify that?
Oof, I mean, that's much more your area than mine, I think.
Well, and I haven't seen it.
Giving guys, like simplifying the reads for most players, I would think is whether there's a data driven way to do that, I'm sure there is, but
let me even go simpler. There's so much ball screen in the game.
Yeah.
So like, is there data that's going to help a player understand when they should be making a decision as a handler on the ball screen? Let's just start from just their perspective. They come off a ball screen. Is there some data that we can help that player understand off of one dribble after you clear the point of the screen versus 2 dribbles after you clear the point of the screen? If there's a better decision most often when you only use 1 dribble versus 2 or something like that.
So this is I think a really good point, a really good thing to get into for coaches is, I don't know if this is for the player, if this is a data question. Mm-hmm. For the coach, for the organization, for the player development person,
for what they should be teaching.
Yeah, you're sort of studying.
That's what
you can kind of see. All right, if you take, like, when he takes that extra dribble, what happens? Mm-hmm. And then you don't need to, like, my sense is most players are going to tune that out. But hey, this works better when you make the 1 dribble and make a read. And so we're going to work on that. Like, they don't totally need to know in most cases the why. Then there's some players who are going to process things at, speeds which that the data can sort of self-correct with the data. I think that's a relatively small group of players that may increase This is something we've seen in baseball, is as sort of the data has been in baseball for long enough, there are more and more players coming up who are conversant in sort of self-diagnosis through that kind of thing.
Are you seeing that in basketball too?
It's a little early yet, and I have some questions about whether the relative complexity of the sport being a more dynamic kind of flow-based game, I think it'll probably be something that we'll see more of, but I don't think it's ever going to be at the level where, a pitcher can go look at his spin rate, and look at his grip in a high-speed camera and self-diagnose that way. I'm not sure that we're especially close to reaching that point with basketball.
I would agree with that. I would agree. So ultimately the challenge for all coaches is what are some ways they can translate, this information into easily accessible direction for players or for themselves in terms of what to coach. But let's maybe start from, what can I give the players that would help them?
I mean, that's why coaches get the big bucks, right? Is making those decisions. There's something I think I sent this to you. Is there was an article I think in Sports Illustrated about it's a Bill Belichick a play breakdown technique called padding.
Can I read the part that you?
Sure,
please. I love the part. It said Belichick might consider hundreds of factors in any one game, but he wants his Patriots to focus on no more than 2 or 3 specific to each player, funneling complexity into digestible emphasis.
And that's it right there. How do we do that? I don't know. I think the fact that part of the reason I would think that Belichick is one of the great coaches in the history of sports is he has some kind of ability, whether it's pattern recognition or whatever, that he can actually take in that 100 inputs and distill it into the ones that are important. I think for most, it's you're asking too much. And, it's a kind of thing where it's like any other training, you get stronger at it, the more you do. So I think my advice for coaches starting out is, pick a smaller number of kind of indicators that you're looking at and you get reps, taking those in and making decisions and kind of iterate on that. And as you learn more, you can kind of add more ingredients to the pot.
So let's go back to the basics then. Any, high school coach doesn't have access to Synergy. What in your opinion should they be tracking, or what opinion should they be getting information on that will help them help their team, help their players improve and help their team win?
So assuming you have access to be able to watch the game later and maybe have an assistant or two to help chart these things, the things that I would want to know are who was on the floor, what were we in, what was the sort of the process outcome of this? What was the, did we get it? Did we have how would we grade this possession in terms, whether it's shot quality, whether it's, got to the free throw line, turned the ball over, or whatever. Those would be the 3 things that I would want to know. And then from there, you can start to, if you collect those kind of consistently across a number of games, I think you can start to see the patterns start to emerge of which player combinations are working, which aren't, maybe some indication as to why they aren't. Okay, when we have our backup point guard on the floor, we turn the ball over a lot. So what can we do what are our safer things we can run, since we know that we have trouble executing, more complex things without our starter in the game? That would be sort of an example of something that I think would be helpful. You tell me, does that sound like something that's doable? It's complex, and it's going to, especially the first couple times you start to chart these things, it's going to take a while, but as you do it more, it gets easier, and you got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And I truthfully, I credit so many high school coaches. I mean, definitely in our basketball immersion community that I interact with a little bit deeper, I am so impressed with how much they are accomplishing. Really, and from using students or assistants or parents or different things like that, the things that they're tracking, like I'm super impressed. So I think it is time to challenge them and to say, hey, these are the things that we think are the most valuable. Potentially try them and find out. And yeah, I think they're ready.
And I would add one thing on top of this. A friend of mine who Zach Bover, who's assistant at Indiana State, has he's described in the past the staffs he's worked on have used kind of analytics tracking in two ways. As he describes it, it's religiously and liberally. And the religiously, he means as a coaching staff, these are the things we're tracking this season. And that's stone tablet stuff. That's like, we decided before the season what we're looking at, what's important. This is what it's going to be for the season. And that discussion is over. For players, lie, cheat, steal, make stuff up, whatever, just get them to do whatever data. You can slice it any way you want. You're trying to influence them to do the things on the floor that you've evaluated will work. And so I think for the tracking point for coaches there is pick what you think is important and give it some time and work with it before you start to, you don't want to mess with the engine while the plane is flying. And then you can, after, half a season, a month, whatever, however long it is, you can kind of look back and say, that's not quite capturing the information I want. So let's change it up. But you want to be consistent with what you're capturing for enough time to evaluate whether it's working for you.
So before I ask the actual question, maybe tell us, because this is a fascinating part of the book, is why the defensive metrics are bad. So let's start with that.
If it came down to one question, how do I count what didn't happen? And I talked earlier about, that like a great defensive outcome is, you close out on a guy and he does nothing. Like he doesn't shoot. He doesn't pass to the next open player. He doesn't drive by you. You just contain the ball. That shows up nowhere in the vast majority in really any sort of stat tracking that we have. But that's the A+ outcome. And if you're not capturing the A+ outcome from a defensive standpoint, you could see how the problems sort of cascade from there.
So Eli Horowitz, who is PR director for the LA Sparks, actually sent me kind of that. And then I kind of looked back after he had said that, because he had made the point that kind of your argument made him a little more skeptical of some of the offensive ones, which I'm curious to get your thoughts on. Are we skeptical of the offensive ones, or we're pretty good with that despite the defensive deficiencies?
So there's in studying basketball from a statistical lens, there are a lot of paradoxes where the defensive side is not the inverse of the offensive side. Mm-hmm. So the example at the NBA level is that if you're defining shot selection just by like where the shots are taken from, there was a time when that one thing told you a lot about how good an offense was. It kind of doesn't anymore. Like as the 3-pointer was becoming a bigger thing and sort of the catch and shoot mid-ranger was being phased out, the teams that were earlier on that bus were gaining an advantage. Now that everyone has sort of got that memo, it's now again, it's a little bit more, okay, yeah, you maybe can gain a slight advantage there, but it's mostly about taking the shots your guys can make. Now, on the defensive end, since you're playing against everybody, where you're allowing shots as a defense tells us a great deal about how good a defense is. So even though this thing doesn't matter offensively anymore, it matters tremendously defensively. And there are those kind of paradoxes all throughout the sport. So yeah, on some level, if we can't really evaluate the defense, how can we evaluate the offense? There's some truth to that. But it's still, we get to good enough with the offensive metrics we have, just if for no other reason than the stuff we're tracking better captures the offensive process than anything we're tracking really does with defense.
Great answer. And Ben Resner, who's an NBA G League coach, he did a masterclass presentation for us, which is available for everyone on YouTube, but it's modern basketball positions, player development, scouting, and lineup balance. And really, again, his argument, which I'm curious to get your thoughts are, is that the way we traditionally define lineups doesn't apply anymore, and that we should be thinking differently in terms of how we position players, but also in terms of how we define them. And I'm guessing, based on all the stuff that you share in the book and what you're talking about now, that you would somewhat agree with that we have to get beyond our traditional thinking.
To a degree. I think thinking like in line, you're talking about like lineup balance, like there are a mix of skills you want on the floor.
Yes.
And this is something we can study a little bit, but it's also, I mean, the traditional wisdom is not too far off. And okay, we need, someone who can create with the ball in his hands, and people who can space the floor, and some people who can screen and finish at the rim, and, in various combinations of that sort of work to different levels. And it's probably better to think in those terms. However, I think when we're looking at sort of the population of players, for whatever reason, though they do kind of tend to fall into positional archetypes along kind of the old, just if for no other reason than that's how they've always played basketball. So it's often actually a difficulty in like fitting in sort of an odd, like a player with an oddly shaped skill set, because everyone else is sort of more defined shapes. And how do you fit those together? Like, in the NBA level, like Ben Simmons is sort of a classic example of this, right? He's sort of hard to build around, not because he's bad, but because his mix of skills is so unusual that the other four guys around him have to do sort of more unusual things for players of their sort of rough size and kind of defense and possible defensive roles. So the fact that, is he a point guard? Is he a power forward? I mean, those labels are maybe antiquated, but they still kind of describe, for the most part, would it be 80 or 90% of players probably fit into one of those boxes pretty well. And so it's a useful shorthand, at least. It
is useful shorthand. And the question is, like, is it because we still define them at a really young level according to those positions? And that becomes a greater discussion, which I would argue that I'd rather have someone say they're a basketball player at a young age than say they're a position. Because obviously, as you said, if you're suddenly getting a team with a Ben Simmons type player, what position you traditionally play may be different. But as you said, the same type of skill application or decision-making might still apply. I really love it. That's a great answer to be able to connect those things. And it's a really fascinating conversation. Seth, the mid-range theory, it's just an outstanding book and stimulating so many questions just now, but for everyone who reads it as well. Curious then, maybe what's maybe one of the questions or one of the things that's been stimulated in your mind since you released the book that somebody's raised a question to you and has been maybe the most stimulating for you?
Oh man, I had an answer and then it just completely went away. That's funny.
That's right. Take your time. We can edit.
Yeah.
Out if you want, or we can.
No, I had. Oh, okay. No, I got it. Okay. So it's funny, you kind of when you write things on the internet, never read the comments is sort of a maxim to live by. So I've tried to avoid too much, but one of the sort of an interesting kind of I would say criticism that I've seen occasionally of the book is that it's not about any one big idea, that it's about a number of small ideas. And so like, why wasn't there this one thing? And I think that's a really good question, because I think that the better way to look at it is the number of small edges. There may have been a time in any given sport where there's a big aha that was a sea change in the way the game is thought about, and having the right answer to that is a big advantage. I think we're well past that in basketball. I think we were probably past that in basketball well before we got to the point of doing, quote unquote analytics. 3-pointer maybe, but But I think something was like figured out like pretty early in the run of basketball, that it's why the play of the game hasn't changed that much in the last, I don't know, 60 years. But it's about these small edges, these little places you can be better. And that's really much more what looking at basketball through a statistical lens is, than one big, I've changed everything and everything you know is wrong, and anyone who doesn't see it this way can no longer compete. So I just that very bottom up mindset of looking at the game, looking for little places where you can do things better, and those little things add up. I mean, I think that's almost the beauty of, offensive and defensive rating is per 100 possessions. Like, if you think about that, it's not something that improves a team's offensive rating by 1 point. At the NBA level, that's worth 2 or 3 wins. But you think about how small an edge that is over the course of a game, that this is going to be worth, that we do this every time over 100 possessions, it's going to give us 1 more point. And that's really what we're going for. And so I think that's like, that ethic is really one of the things I hope people take away from the book.
Well, and I think coaches do appreciate that. And I'm imagining, like, I'm not saying for sure it was more of a fan-based comment, but it's also like better marketing to have one big idea. But the reality is it's not one big idea. So I'm glad you didn't have one just big idea, because as you said, it's not that simple. Maybe something, Seth, from your perspective, you wrote the book, you've got feedback, you've been thinking deeply, you've been doing these interviews. Is there something that maybe upon reflection you wish you had added, or you added, maybe discussed deeper, or maybe it's a prelude to the next book?
I think I originally, when I was like, did the original outline of the book, I had the idea to do like a chapter on what you might call people analytics. That's, personality stuff and interpersonal interaction. I got a really good advice from someone early on that a great place to start talking about that kind of things would be like people who do data work with dating and matchmaking companies, because that's a similar kind of interpersonal situation. But as I got in and I started learning more about that, both from the dating side, and then heard some fascinating stories there, as one might imagine. I realized that's not a chapter, that's a book. And it's a book that I would need to like re-educate myself significantly to be able to do justice. So I don't know if it's something I wish I had been able to put in the book, because I don't think I would have been able to come close to doing it justice. But that's sort of something that I had originally thought about doing more of, and I decided to, kind of scale it back and really just only include it as, hey, this is something people are going to continue learning about in the future, rather than really illustrate how and why it might work.
Such a fascinating thing. And it's all so fun. And I'm so grateful for you, Seth. I mean, for sharing the game with us, and for sharing these ideas. And I cannot encourage coaches enough to get the Mid-Range Theory. It's a great read for all levels of basketball, and all, again, stimulate your thinking about what you're doing and how you're doing it. And the question is there a better way? And we feel that there's always that type of approach that's going to help us all develop. So thanks for sharing with us.
Oh, thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun. I really enjoy getting kind of the feedback from sort of the coaching side of the game. I think it's easy to get sort of lost in your own like bubble, and it's always important to have the broader, more holistic perspective, because it's the game is complicated enough that people are coming at it from a number of different angles, and it all matters. And to really understand what's going on, you need to be able to account for all of those perspectives, even if your experience and your expertise is primarily in sort of one subgenre of the game.
And it's complicated enough, but by and large, we all want the same outcome, which is for our players to get better and for our team to be successful. So it just makes sense that more and more people are receptive to any type of thing that will help that happen.